Good morning. Let's begin. In the first couple of weeks, we covered some introductory material for the Gospel of John, and we're going to start today into chapter 1. And for a lot of us, the words at the beginning of chapter 1 are very memorable, but they might have deeper meaning than we think. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, there's actually the Greek word that's translated word is actually very difficult to translate into English. It's a word logos. It's the root word of the word logic, among other things in English. And also knowledge. That's why all of our knowledge words like biology, the knowledge of life, have the L-O-G-Y at the end. And so this Greek term we studied in more depth in the spring. It has a lot of different meanings, a lot of different ways you could translate it: a reason or logic or a message, a meaning, a law, rule, reasoning, something rational. There's just a wide range of meanings, so it's really impossible to choose a single English word that communicates what it is. But it was first used in this sense in Greek philosophy 500 years before Christ. And they used it to mean an impersonal force of reason, something that orders the universe, that makes the universe rational and not just chaos and so on. This kind of a reasoning force that permeates the universe. It became a Stoic concept among the Stoic philosophers, but then it also got picked up by Jews later. Jews tried to mix some of the Greek philosophical ideas with Old Testament religion. So amongst those who picked up on the idea were what are called Hellenized Jews. After Alexander the Great conquered this whole region in 300-something BC, Greek became the primary language, and a lot of Greek thought spread through the area. And the Hellenized Jews were the ones who spoke Greek primarily, but who were also influenced by Greek ideas. And some of those ideas don't really mix necessarily all that well with the Old Testament. Greek became such a common language that it led to the project to translate the Old Testament into Greek, because most of the Jews weren't even reading and writing Hebrew anymore. And so that's how the Septuagint, the translation of the Old Testament to Greek, came about, is because the Hellenized Jews said, the people need the scriptures in Greek, not Hebrew, because people were losing touch with Hebrew. They were so Greek influenced. Now, the concept that we studied last spring was that in Greek philosophy, the logos became some in-between being, between some ultimate God and us. And that the ultimate God created this logos, who then did the rest of the creating. So the logos was a lesser God, a created being, but who was then another type of creator himself. So this was this kind of strange to our minds concept that they had. So what is John trying to say by using this word that's in a sense not really compatible with the Bible? What's he doing here? And we mentioned it seems to be traditionally translated as the Word. The first thing we read in John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, some scholars decades ago, when they came across this, said John was maybe borrowing this idea from one of those Hellenized Jews, namely Philo of Alexandria, Egypt. But I believe actually what we know now is there's a lot better explanations than that. In the spring, we looked at three of them. I'm going to jump to the third one, which is that what John is doing is proclaiming something that is superior to everything that was associated with the word logos. And in fact, I believe that a lot of what we find in the Gospel of John is the declaration that Jesus is superior to what they know. Jesus' way is superior to their old rituals. Jesus is the fulfillment of the Jewish festivals or feasts. And Jesus triumphs over life and death itself with an extended resurrection section beginning with the resurrection by Jesus of Lazarus. And so the whole Gospel of John is, in a sense, the superiority of Jesus Christ to many of the things they were familiar with. Whether they were Greek concepts or mixed Greek-Jewish concepts. So let's take just one piece of this opening sentence at a time. In the beginning was the Word. Well, remember, what was the Greek concept of logos? In the beginning was the God. Well, the logos was created. There was some ultimate God who created this intermediate being. And so right off the bat, Jesus is saying, no, the mediator between God and man is Jesus Christ. But Christ, that is the Son of God, even before he became incarnate as Jesus, always existed. In the beginning was the logos, not some point in time got created. The Son of God wasn't created by the Father. The Son of God exists eternally. And so all of these Hellenized Jews tried to adapt this Greek idea by suggesting other mediators between God and man, other people at that midpoint, like maybe Moses or maybe the current high priest or prophets or something. Well, Jesus Christ is superior to all of these candidates to be the mediator between God and man because he has existed forever. They were all just created. Jesus Christ, the true Logos, was from the beginning. And the Logos, the Word, was with God. Now, the word with doesn't have real strong meaning to us today in context here. But the way it was used in Greek, if two persons, or one was with the other, that means they're equals. They're face-to-face equals. You would never say, I'm, with the king or someone who's superior to you. To say that the Logos was with God is saying the Logos is equal to God. The Logos has a face-to-face relationship of equals with God. Now that doesn't agree with this Greek concept at all either, does it? Because not only was the Logos created, but he was a lesser being in Greek philosophy. So these first two clauses are big statements by John. No. Christ is the Logos. He's existed forever, and he's not some lesser being than God. He's equal to God. And finally, he closes out verse 1 in saying the punchline, and the Word was God. Now, this is the concept of the Trinity, which is very difficult for our minds to say. The Logos, the Son, is a different person than the Father, and yet they're the same being. So we describe the doctrine of the Trinity as there's one being who exists in three persons. Now, that's very foreign to our minds because I'm one person and one being, and so are you. But what it means is that the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit have personal qualities. They do the things that persons do, like communicate to each other, and yet they don't have conflicting wills. They aren't separate beings. And so what John is saying here, when you sum all this up, as compared to that picture that the Greeks and some of the Jews had who had been influenced by the Greeks, we're not looking for a mediator between God and man who was created by God. We're not looking for one who's lesser than God. It's God himself. God himself mediates between God and man. Now, how can you do that? Because one of the fundamental human problems is we feel distant from God. I mean, we say we know he's present here, but, we're human. My eyeballs can't see him. So people feel distant from God, and God knows that we need to be connected to him. And so God's genius here is demonstrated by having his Son become incarnate as the man Jesus. Because now God becomes connected to us. We have something we can picture. We can read the story of the life of Jesus, and we have something we can picture. And one question I asked last spring when we talked about this was, if you didn't have the New Testament, if you knew nothing of that, how would you picture God? Well, we have all these pictures of the old man in the sky with the white beard and all this. We know that's not accurate. We know that's just our struggling to try to picture something. But if you didn't have Jesus to fix your mind upon, how would you picture God? How would you relate to God? It'd be very, very difficult, wouldn't it? And so God's genius, his omniscience, is demonstrated that he knows that we are going to feel distant from him if he doesn't do something to reach across and bridge that gap. And so he always intended, the Son's role was always, from before the creation of the world, destined to be incarnate so that he would connect us to God. And John is saying, this is superior to any concept of the Logos that any Greeks or Jews could have. This truly connects us directly to God. Someone who is God, who's equal with God, who's eternal because he is God, becomes incarnate, and now we can picture him living a life on earth, having a ministry from Galilee and all the things we read about in the New Testament. And we can connect to that. It's hard to connect to God in the absence of that. So, God knew that there was a gulf that needed to be bridged, and he did it. And that's something unique to Christianity. There is no religion in the world that's like this in this way. Now, just as a little sidelight here, I won't get into too much detail, but the Jehovah's Witnesses believe that God the Father, before he started creating the earth, created angels, and the first one he created was what's called the Archangel Michael. Michael is mentioned as appearing to Daniel, for example, a couple of places in the book of Daniel. And they believe that Michael was incarnated as Jesus. So they're going back to the idea of a created lesser being becoming the mediator between God and man. They don't believe in the Trinity. They use the name Jehovah and Jehovah's Witnesses because it's a word for the Father from certain translations of the Old Testament. They're kind of a Father only, not Son, in a Trinity sense. So that's what they believe, which is why they're not considered an orthodox sect of Christians. And they came up with their own translation of the Bible, the New World Translation, because they wanted to translate certain verses their way. And not surprisingly, John 1:1 is one of the prominent examples. Because what I've just presented about the meaning of John 1, verse 1, is a Trinitarian conception. And so in their translation, it concludes not, and the Word was God, but the Word was a God, lowercase g, which just means a divine being, which means maybe like Michael, the angel. And so much has been written, and we won't go into all the details, but Greek scholars who are not Jehovah's Witnesses don't agree with their grammatical argument as to why this Greek should be translated a God instead of God, capital G. And no other translation goes along with their translation on this. And furthermore, their translation isn't even consistent, because the Greek phrase, the Greek grammar construction in question happens 282 times in the New Testament. And almost always their own translation doesn't come up with a God, it's God. And so it's very special pleading to go to a few verses, primarily in John, and translate them specially, and then not be consistent with the same Greek elsewhere more than 200 times. If you want, we could talk in more detail about that. I'll spare you at the moment. That's enough overview. So, compared Christ to what? Compound owner. You know, they have compounds, and there's always an owner of the compound. Oh. So that's how he got the message across, but it was totally inadequate. When people try to make analogies about the Trinity, quite often they come up with something that's misleading. The second section here of John chapter 1, John launches right into John the Baptist, his ministry, his testimony about Christ. So we'll just read these verses. This is John's testimony when the Jews from Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him, "Who are you?" He did not refuse to answer, but he declared, "I am not the Messiah." "What then?" they asked him. "Are you Elijah?" "I am not," he said. "Are you the prophet?" "No," he answered. "Who are you then?" they asked. "We need to give an answer to those who sent us. What can you tell us about yourself?" He said, "I am a voice of one crying out in the wilderness, 'Make straight the way of the Lord,' just as Isaiah the prophet said." Now they had been sent from the Pharisees, so they asked him, "Why then do you baptize if you aren't the Messiah or Elijah or the prophet?" "I baptize with water," John answered them. "Someone stands among you, but you don't know him. He is the one coming after me, whose sandal strap I'm not worthy to untie." Now let's look at what happened here. the big picture we get is that John is humble. He has all kinds of opportunity to declare himself to be some great figure, but he deflects. Throughout his career, he deflects everything towards Christ. In Deuteronomy, one of the messianic prophecies that we studied last fall is that there will be a prophet who will come. A prophet as great or greater than Moses. And we studied a year ago how that was somewhat confusing to the Jews because there are messianic prophecies that the Messiah is a king. There are messianic prophecies that the Messiah is a prophet. There's messianic prophecy that he's a new high priest. And then there are the prophecies that he's the suffering servant who dies for the sins of the people. And so one of the problems they had was, how can these four things all be one person? And one of the ways they tried to explain it was, well, maybe the Messiah comes and maybe the prophet comes along with him. It isn't the same person. It's like a helper. And maybe the suffering servant who dies isn't the same person as the Messiah. Maybe he is a helper of some sort. That way they could keep their conception of the Messiah is the new victorious king, which doesn't really seem to go very well with he's going to die, for example. And so when these Jews said, "Are you the prophet?" Well, their conception was wrong. Their conception was that the Messiah is not the new great prophet, that it's somebody else who comes along with the Messiah. So he has to say no, because it's a misconception in the first place. And then how about Elijah? Well, there's a messianic prophecy that we'll get to in a moment about this kind of somewhat confusing idea of Elijah. But let's just stop and think about the humility of John and what does it mean to us today? John was one of the great figures of Christian history, wasn't he? And yet, what did he do? He just deflected all praise to Christ throughout his career. Think about today where you have people get prominent in Christianity and they get on TV and whatever, and they make themselves out to be, a really big deal. How do they compare to John the Baptist in the history of Christianity? How important are they today? Just because someone say a famous preacher today, how important are they compared to John the Baptist? Not very. And yet they will sometimes make themselves up to be the leader of some little earthly empire practically. And John the Baptist's example is what? Deflect all attention to Jesus, not for himself. Malachi 4:5 had this Elijah reference. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. They asked John the Baptist, "Are you Elijah?" And he says, "No." Why would he say no? Well, once again, just like when they asked, "Are you the prophet?" they had a misconception. They thought that because Elijah was taken up to heaven in the chariot of fire and never died, that he would literally return, incarnate to earth when the Messiah came. And he would, based on this one verse, based on an overly literal reading of this verse, that as opposed to being a symbol of prophecy, that it would literally be Elijah come back. And so John the Baptist has to answer, no, I am not literally the same person that you read about in the Old Testament. I haven't been up in heaven for centuries and come back. I'm just John the Baptist. But Jesus says, when he's talking to his disciples and they ask, what about the fact that Elijah was supposed to come? And what does Jesus say? He says, if you can receive it, John the Baptist was Elijah. Who is to come. Now, so is this a contradiction? Jesus says if you can accept it, if you can receive it, John the Baptist was the Elijah to come. Whereas when you ask John the Baptist, he says, no, I'm not Elijah. But see, they're talking about two different things. The people who asked John the Baptist, are you Elijah, were asking, are you the reappearance on earth of Elijah? And he says no. But that's not how Malachi 4:5 was intended in the first place. A new Elijah is coming, that is, a new prophet to proclaim before the Messiah. And you'll notice that Jesus uses conditional language here. If you can receive it, John the Baptist serves the prophetic purpose of the Elijah that Malachi talked about. But if you don't, then he doesn't serve that purpose in your life. It's up to you. And one of the themes in the Gospels is the question that Jesus poses several times, why don't you follow John the Baptist? Why did you not follow John the Baptist's message? Why did you not accept it? Which he especially poses to Jewish leaders. Because whether John the Baptist serves a function as the new Elijah coming before the Messiah depends on whether people listen. And if they don't listen, if they don't receive it, if you receive it, his job is to turn people's hearts towards the Lord. But whether their hearts turn toward the Lord depends on whether they receive it. It depends on their response to John the Baptist's message. So is he serving the role of a new Elijah in the people's lives? The answer is, well, for some people, yes, and for a lot of people, no. And in any case, he was not literal Elijah. He wasn't the same man that we read about in the Old Testament. Now, the baptism of Jesus is told in flashback form, past tense, in John. And this is something John does a lot. He seems to assume that you already know Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And therefore, he doesn't have to explain certain things. And this is one of the ways we know John was written last. So that leaves us with the question, Jesus, he was preaching a baptism of repentance for forgiveness of sins. That's what John the Baptist was doing. Well, Jesus didn't need to repent or have any sins forgiven. So why do you think he went to John the Baptist to be baptized? What was the purpose of that? To set an example, and also to set an example of humility. If John the Baptist is going to be humble and deflect everything towards Jesus, well, now what's Jesus going to do? Is he going to set himself up above John the Baptist and look down on John the Baptist? Or is he going to follow and set the same example of humility and be humble even in the presence of John the Baptist? Right. John says to him, why are you coming to me? I need to be baptized by you. Well, that's the whole point, is that they're both being humble, right? John's being humble in the presence of Christ, and Christ is being humble in the presence of John the Baptist. And if he validates John the Baptist's ministry, then that sets up his own ministry. Right? So we'll pick up there next time. Thank you.